again, the library here owes a debt of gratitude to Mark Ferrari for everything that he has done to help us get through this crazy time, and in a genre that we really did not have a lot of depth of knowledge in. And Mark, you've been really wonderful in helping us out this summer, and we really appreciate it.
It's been my pleasure. I'm just relieved that when somebody's grandchildren ask me, Mark, what did you do in the pandemic? I'll have an answer now. That's a big relief.
It is a big relief, yes. Okay, so tonight we have Tina Connolly with us. She is an author in adult and young adult literature, and in the fantasy and in sci-fi also, Tina?
Yes.
Sci-fi also. Okay, I know that's a big Star Wars, Star Trek kind of thing. So fantasy and sci-fi, and actually her and Mark know each other really well, and I'm going to let Mark take over, and we're going to hear all about Tina and her writing. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you,
Mary. Well, Tina, hi.
Yes.
Thank you so much for joining us. And
yes.
we have had guests this summer who approach fantasy literature from all sorts of directions. We've had a university professor, we've had game makers, we have had illustrators, we have had all sorts of people, but you are our first author so far who approaches this from, among other standpoints, young fiction. Fiction for young people, YA. So you're
yes.
the first one coming at it from that angle. And me and Kathy are really looking forward to hearing more about that tonight. But first, I would just like you to sort of tell us more about yourself. Who are you? Where did you come from? What are all the sorts of things you write and all of the creative venues in which you participate in crafting story? Because it's a lot bigger than YA fantasy. So,
okay, how long do we have?
As long as you want to take.
Well, I live in Portland, Oregon with my family, and I am from Kansas originally, but I've been out here for at least 15 years. I've visited the islands numerous times, and it's one of the most gorgeous places in the world. So being here in Portland on my laptop computer is a pale second best to actually be there tonight talking to all of you. I do adult fantasy and young adult fantasy primarily, but I also write middle grade, and I do write across fantasy and science fiction. I write short stories, flash fiction, plays as well. So the gamut of a lot of things. And I work on a couple podcasts. So I work for Escape Pod, which is possibly, I think, the largest science fiction short story podcast. They've been podcasting for about 10 years. You can get a short story every single week. 15 years of it. Anyway, and I run my very own podcast called Toasted Cake, which does flash fiction, which is bite-sized, tiny, tiny stories. And that is a very idiosyncratically timed podcast as far as when I have time to do it. But we are in the middle of a season right now where I'm running some stories that are largely positive and optimistic and hopeful in nature. So that's what I'm doing right now. And also I have two children who are 6 and 9.
Is there a backlist that we can access? Can we go back and listen to all your old episodes?
Yes, you can. So that's over on toastedcake.com, and I have, 225 episodes at this point somehow.
Excellent.
Somehow.
Good. Wow.
So that is some of the many things I do, in addition to having 2 small children, which takes a lot of time, especially right now.
Did you mention the theater before I interrupted you?
I used to do a lot of acting, and I still do playwriting.
We have actually seen, Tina, did you write the play, the one about in the future, or you wrote that, right?
Yeah. Did you see Box? Yes, right, you did. Yes, I remember. That was at the
Box,
Hip Bone.
Right, yeah. So we have seen plays that Tina wrote for local theater when we lived in Portland. Yes. Yeah. So.
So that was a play. When you saw it, we were performing it as a very unusual structure. We broke it up into 3 pieces, and you had to come back each Monday to see the next part in the serial. Yeah. We restaged that a few years later after you'd moved, which is why I was confused for a moment, and where we tried to condense it into a single night. So that was a new, both things were very interesting experiments and a lot of fun, and I still like that story a lot.
Great. Well, thank you for that more illuminating introduction. So I think that we're going to talk, we're going to start off at least talking about YA tonight, and then maybe branch out into whatever you feel moved to branch out into, or whatever Kathy is interested in hearing more about. So Kathy, do feel free to chime in if there's something in particular you'd love to know.
Okay,
so,
I'm going to mute though, and then unmute.
Okay, that's just fine.
Okay.
So I think the first things I read by you, Tina, were actually adult fantasy fiction. It was your Iron Mask series in a lot of those books. But then Shannon called your YA series, the first book was Seriously Wicked, I believe.
Yes.
Called that to my attention, and I'm a big fan of YA. I read quite a bit of YA, actually. I have reasons of my own for being interested in it, which I will not go into here because I'm not tonight's guest. But I am curious about how you ended up writing YA, why you ended up writing YA, and what you have learned in the process of doing so about the particular virtues and strengths and superpowers of YA literature. So why don't you start by just talking about, your experience of YA?
Sure. So I would say that I've always been I've always had a real focus on children's fiction, as in middle grade, and young adult YA fiction. That was kind of my main interest from the beginning. And even when I was getting my English degree, I actually wrote, like, one of my theses was all on a bunch of the grotesque in children's literature. So that has been kind of my main passion, and I have a lot of middle grade and young adult fiction here at home. So when I started trying to write books, even though most of my short stories are on the adult side, when I started trying to write books, actually where I sort of finally found a foothold where my brain would go, oh, I see how to write a long story instead of a very short one. Seriously Wicked was actually one of the first really completed books I ever wrote, and it was the one I got an agent on. That was during the recession of 2009, so we didn't sell it, and I went on to write some adult books, etc. But so, when I came back to it, when I was able to sell it later, it is kind of actually where my heart lies. Seriously Wicked is a story about a girl who lives with a seriously wicked witch. So it's very lighthearted, it's very clean and fun and full of humorous situations. So I wrote it to be pretty much, for me, just the sort of thing I would want to read. At the time, I didn't know if I would have any luck selling it at all. So I was like, I'm going to throw in everything that I think is funny. Like, there's a demon and he likes to act like Elvis, and there's bananas, and I mean, just, whatever I thought was funny, it all went in. So it's the story of a girl realizing that her, without too many spoilers, trying to deal with the fact that the stepmother she lives with is a wicked witch, and what does that mean to her? What if she doesn't want to be wicked herself? But it's also a lot of what I thought was funny at the time when I was writing it.
Well, having read the book, it's hilarious and endlessly entertaining. And I was particularly interested in your very quick passing reference to the fact that you decided to write this book because it was what you wanted to write. When in an earlier conversation, we were mentioning the fact that some people get the idea that authors write about what will sell, that somebody tells them what people want to read, and then authors write a book about it. But of course, that's not really what happens. Authors write what they have in them to write because it's in there wanting to be written. Right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. I mean, and I think I've always had the best luck finishing projects and finishing things that I really love when I'm like, I'm going to write exactly what I want. And in fact, even if I go to my agent and I say, whoa, what do you think about project A versus project B? She's like, which one do you want to write? What is calling to you? And there's a lot of truth in that, because what is calling to you is something that you will finish and that you will put things that are important to you in. I'm sure there are definitely people who can write to order. You can say, I'd like a story about blah, 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 and they can write it, but I can't do that very well. It pretty much has to be something that is entertaining to me.
Yeah. I think that you can tell usually when the author loved the book that they were writing or not. There's a whole other dimension of resonance in a book that the author was really loving than one that was formulaic and put together because it needed to be done. Mm-hmm. So seriously, Wicked is a book about a teenage witch in high school, as you've pointed out.
Yeah.
Was there something about a teenage witch in high school that resonated with you as a person, specifically for some reason?
Well, so like I said, so sometimes I don't always know what the book's about when I'm working on it. And it turned out that this one was all about the mother-daughter relationship. So it's about the very familiar young adult situation that every teenager goes through of deciding what ways they do and don't want to be like their parent. And Mark, you and I were talking before about, why is fantasy, what makes fantasy awesome to write, and to me, it's because I can take a very familiar situation, being a teenager and trying to figure out, in what ways you want to be like your family, in what ways you want to be someone else, and look at it from a sort of a different perspective, a kind of heightened perspective. Most people do not have a mother who is literally summoning a demon in the basement. And most teenagers do not have to defrost a cow every day to feed the dragon and then try to get all these things stopped in time to stop the demon, especially after the demon gets into their crush. That's why the boy she likes is suddenly dancing like Elvis from another century at this point. So you can take something that's a very familiar thing and then look at it in a new way. And to me, it's as you were just mentioning, I have to enjoy writing when I'm doing well. It's fun to write about dragons. It's fun to write about demons. It's fun to write about all these people who can do ridiculous things. But I think you have to still, the heart of a fantasy story or a humor story or any kind of sort of heightened reality that you're doing, the heart has to still be something real and meaningful and true that we're talking about. And before you ask, I ended up dedicating it specifically to my mother, who is not seriously wicked. So it is not
very politic,
not based on actual reality.
This is not you, Mom.
That's right.
That's right. Well, I find as a fantasy writer as well, and as an avid reader of fantasy, that fantasy, by departing from the actual details of real life, fantasy actually clarifies real life in some ways. That some issues are more easily explored and more clearly understood when you can reduce them in the way that a fantasy novel does, rather than trying to describe them realistically with all of the nuance and complexity and ambiguity that real life contains. Fantasy, because it's not real, actually allows you to make things clearer than they are in real life. Do you have any similar kind of feeling about that? I completely
agree. Yes. Especially because, when Buffy the Vampire Slayer was on, a lot of people said, oh, this is really resonant because they're saying high school is like actual hell. This is what Buffy the Vampire Slayer is it's just making that a very literal observation. And so you're having the heightened showing of what something that was a tricky process for a lot of people, of time that a lot of people have have problems or don't like, going through high school is no fun, but imagine what it would be like if there were demons, actual demons and devils and, everything on Buffy. So, there's some similarities to what they were doing on that show and like to what I was doing with this book. It's again,
Right.
It's just a new way of expanding it and looking at it from a different perspective.
Yeah, I mean, and of course, if anybody really remembers junior high or high school very well, there were demons. Of course there were demons. And every day you went to school already planning how you were going to deal with them.
That's right.
It's actually not so far-fetched.
Yeah.
You said a moment ago, most people don't have a mother casting demons in the basement. Well, some of us do.
Yeah.
I mean,
True.
It may not be quite as literal, but I think that we all get that immediately,
Yeah.
because
I completely agree.
It's pretty clear which real life experiences we're looking at through the other lens here. You did talk about humor very briefly a while ago. An awful lot of your work contains humor. I think it's one of its many particular virtues. So what's the role of humor in your life? Where did that sense of humor come from? Why do you think it's important to you? Why does humor exist so prominently in your life and show up in such important ways in your writing?
That's a good question. So now I'm wondering, are there people who don't really want there to be any humor in their life and don't want to have, funny things around and laugh? I really like laughing. I like funny things to happen.
How funny was the last Stephen King novel you read?
Well, it's been a long time, but I'm sure it was not very funny.
Not so funny. So
Yeah.
Not all authors choose humor, but you clearly have. I'm just wondering, how did humor worm its way into who you are, and what roles do you think it's playing in your life as well as in your writing?
Right. Well, I mean, when I'm reading, I definitely gravitate towards comedies. And when I'm watching shows, I gravitate towards comedies. I have to say, and especially in the last few years, I gravitate towards watching comedies and watching things that are going to be funny and then also, hopefully have some sort of positive resolution by the end, both things of which usually happen in comedies. One of the reasons I thought The Good Place was so incredible, again, trying to avoid spoilers for people who've not managed to see it, but the whole journey of looking at what is good and what is evil, but through a fantasy perspective and through a funny perspective, are two ways of sort of pulling back from this really big, abstract, hairy question and grappling with it in a way that would not make you feel like miserable and worn down after watching a half an hour of it. You would feel like, oh, I learned something, I thought about something, I had a good time doing it. I mean, it's a new, you could even say that in some cases like that, you might sit there and watch it and you might be missing what you're learning because you're laughing at the jokes, but it's going in anyway, and you're sitting, you have a chance to think about it. Right. To me, the best humor, is not slapstick, but it's related. It's based on true things. Again, real characters and real situations. We're looking at stuff from a new perspective. And sometimes, since humor is that element of surprise, sometimes a surprise is like a little shock that can make you think of something in a whole new way.
Right. So somewhere in that answer, you did briefly touch on the idea that humor helps make difficult subjects more approachable and in a way more palatable. Do you think that in your real life, humor helps to make difficult subjects more approachable and more palatable as well?
That's a great question. I'm sure that's true. I'm thinking right now of child rearing, in fact, because
if we talked about trauma long enough, your children would come up. So
eventually,
go with that.
Yeah. So one of the things that, you're trying to do as a parent is get life lessons across in a way that will not make your child run screaming into the other room, or say, I'm not listening. Because I have a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old. And so sometimes presenting things in a humorous fashion is a way to reach someone who is maybe more interested in continuing to fling their oatmeal on the ceiling, or whatever it is. Actually, they have both grown out of the flinging the oatmeal on the ceiling stage.
I'm happy to hear that. Yeah.
Thank goodness. But for example, I have lately started I've lately started to tease my 9-year-old son whenever he demands something instead of asking nicely for it by saying, "Oh, the Lord would like it if we would bring him some food. He's found that none of the examples are quite up to his liking. The Lord would like some bagels over here." And then at that point, he starts laughing, and then he remembers to ask, "Please." And so we've managed to get to that point without a lot of nagging and reminding, and I got to practice my ridiculous British accent. So it's kind of a win-win all the way around.
I see. So humor in your books is in fact reflecting yet another actual aspect of real life in the
yes.
fantasy context.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Right. I suspected so. So you also mentioned earlier, before we go on to some of the other things that we had discussed talking about tonight, you also mentioned earlier that YA fiction had been a passion of yours right from the start. So I'm assuming that you must have grown up reading fiction like that before you even reached the point where you decided, I'm going to make this stuff. You were already reading it?
Oh, yes. And I would say, so I grew up reading fiction when we're talking like the 80s here. There was a lot of middle grade. There was a lot of stuff for what we would call middle grade now. YA was not actually much of a category yet. That didn't really come till later. And honestly, my heart is probably with what we now look at as mostly middle grade, just because my heart is I love the funny books. I love the funny books, and there's some in YA and I love them to pieces, and there's definitely some YA I love to pieces, but middle grade is often where you find the really funny stuff nowadays. And I love that, that's something I can't help but reach for again and again. But yeah, I grew up definitely just devouring everything there was at the library and going, haunting the library book sales. And I still have, I'm sure at least, I've got a couple thousand books in my house, as you could tell. So I probably have at least, 800, 1,000 children's books still that I keep pushing on my children like some sort of dealer. Please read this book. I loved it. It was amazing.
Yes, I guess I should point out to our audience tonight, Kathy, and also to anybody who may be looking at this later, that Tina is not broadcasting from the public library tonight. That is her phone behind her.
Yeah.
So what I'm hoping you'll do is tell us what some of your favorite books have been. Tell us what are some of your all-time favorite books?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, one of my, as a child, not a fantasy book, but one of my favorite authors was Noel Streatfeild, who wrote Ballet Shoes as her most famous one. And she wrote a bunch of other ones along these lines. Because I've always been obsessed with theater and wanting to perform. And she was a working actress in Britain, 1930s or so. And she wrote a lot of stories about child actors working in those times. And so I just devoured these. And at some point, my dad, for birthday presents, started tracking down the ones that I was having trouble finding. So I now have this enormous collection of Noel Streatfeild books, which is lovely. Diana Wynne Jones is another favorite.
What kind of literature would you call that?
So that's just realistic middle grade fiction. What got me about them is that they are all, they're about working kids. The kids were doing the work of trying to become better in theater or dance or all this stuff, and it was just like, oh, that could be me. So that was a real draw at the time. But contemporary wise, I've got some great ones behind me. A friend of mine. Okay, if I try to pull this down, I'm probably going to knock all my books over. But a friend of mine, Carlos Hernandez, his books, Sal and Gabby Break the Universe and Sal and Gabby Fix the Universe, which are out with Rick Riordan Presents, are just two of the most fantastic books I've read in a long time. They're funny, but they're also positive and hopeful and full of just a sort of a wild enjoyment and hope about the future. So those are a couple I've really loved. And then I would say my friend Jen Reese's book, Game of Fox and Squirrels, is another one I read recently that I really adore, which takes a metaphor of a board game and uses it to really strong effect to develop sort of a magical realism effect in her book.
Wow. Great. So let's see here. You have some stories, I believe, about cover art.
Yeah.
How did the cover art for Seriously Wicked come along? I remember being very struck when I saw the book. At first, I wasn't even sure that it was right side up.
I know.
So what are you, tell us some of your cover art stories, because of course the art, I'm a commercial illustrator, and I like to point out that the art is also part of the storytelling medium.
Honestly, it is so much. And as minor proof of that, I was trying to get my son to read one of the Terry Pratchett books the other day. So we looked them up on the ebook library, on the whatever the ebook library thing is called. But the only covers I could find, one of them made it look like it was a book definitely for a like middle-aged audience. And it had I think it had some buttons on it. And I was like, this is very nice and classic. And I can see why my 9-year-old is like, that is the most boring thing that I've ever seen, and I will not read it at all. And I was like, okay, I get you. But yeah, so I'm sure there's another cover out there for the exact same book that he would love, but this one was for a different audience, and the audience was not a 9-year-old boy. So I do think there's a real, there's an important element to finding the right cover art for the audience you're trying to go for. And I totally understand why, and sometimes they have multiple covers, so that you can appeal to those different segments of the audience. So anyway, I was delighted with this one because I found out a little bit of the story about it later. So the artist on this one is Emma Goulder. And she wrote me later, and we got in touch, and she was saying, yeah, when the request came in, it was a quick turnaround, and I didn't have time to hire a model. So she said that she set up her own bedroom and put the self-timer on the camera, popped down to the shop and bought some tights because she's British, and set the whole thing up, and then just took a picture of herself to get the cover right. So I thought that was kind of a fun story. And so then when I sold 2 more books in that series to my editor, I wrote Emma, and I was like, okay, so I hope you have a bike. And I hope you have a cauldron. So she found all the props and set up all the things again and again, and dug out the same clothes and took the pictures for the other books.
Wow.
Yeah.
Good thing you happened to end up with an illustrator who had a figure that could pass for a teenage girl.
I know, worked out very well.
Worked out really well, didn't it? Yes.
Yeah.
So it is interesting what covers convey about stories. Clive Barker was a superstar in horror for many, many years. I mean, the heir apparent to Stephen King for a long time, people thought. And that's almost all he wrote. But all of a sudden, back in the 90s, I believe, he wrote a big, thick novel called Weave World. And that novel is unabashedly fantasy, contemporary fantasy. It's a fabulous book. It's one of my favorite books ever, but it's all about magic and, supernatural creatures living in a carpet. A carpet turns out to contain an entire world. And it is so fantasy. But the cover is a black cover with a gold foil kind of radiant design on it and a hole in the middle. And in the middle of that hole is this big sort of distorted face screaming in horror. And when you open the cover up, behind that die-cut hole, there is this big fantasy map full of all of these fantasy images with a person sort of falling into it with this horrified expression on his face. But they arranged the cover so that this fantasy novel would look like a horror novel, because they knew that fantasy fans were not into Clive Barker because he wrote horror, and horror fans would not want to read a fantasy. So
that's really smart.
They published a fantasy and made the cover look like a horror novel so that Clive's fans would buy it. The sad part is that a lot of fantasy readers probably never read one of the best fantasies I've ever read because of the dang cover. But anyhow, I thought I would share that. What the hell?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think all that, yeah, I think it's all really neat how you decide who you're trying to aim for and what is going to convey, hey, this is what this book is about. You'll like it, pick it up. That's why, I mean, they keep talking to authors about, you shouldn't worry too much if your cover doesn't represent your exact story exactly. It's about trying to get the right person to pick it up, right?
Well, yes. I mean, honestly, as a commercial illustrator for some decades now, what I have always been told is the cover's primary function is to get someone to pick up the book, because once they have it in their hands, the chances that they will buy it increase astronomically. So the cover is to sell the book. We don't really care whether the cover illustrates the book. We just want the cover to sell the book.
Right.
So I don't know whether that's ethical or not, but that certainly is a big part of the agenda from a commercial standpoint.
And that happens in the library too, because the cover of the book will determine whether or not somebody's going to check that book out.
It's true.
Yeah.
It's a good thing that your book has a good cover, Tina.
Mm-hmm.
So,
It is.
Tina, what do you think that your cover conveys? And to whom?
Yeah. Well, I think it conveys the book really well, honestly, because I do think it says, humor to me. It says, it says something lighthearted, because like you said, you wondered if she was upside down for a minute, or if the book was upside down. So to me, looking at this picture of a girl reading spells on her bed upside down does convey the sort of humor and fantasy that is, and humorous magic that's in the book.
But what do you have any thoughts at all about what the style of the cover, the style of the photograph convey?
Good question. I don't know. What do you think? Professional?
Well, the typeface that the title is in is a very kind of wacky, loose, distorted typeface. So that says humor. The light and the color scheme and the tights and the long, luscious hair and all the rest of this says a whole lot about fashion. It's going to speak to teenage girls who like to look good and be wearing the right thing. She doesn't look, she looks like one of those girls who's got all the right accoutrements. She doesn't look nerdy. I mean, it's a very elegant cover. While it's funny, it's also a very elegant color scheme, a lot of elegant lighting. It actually looks more like a cover of Vogue than it looks like, Shrimpy falls on his face at school. It looks very kind of fashionable. So,
that's a great point, Mark. That is also, thank you for your professional opinion on it. That totally makes sense. I hadn't really thought about all those things in that detail.
Yeah.
And Tina,
people to think about covers more.
Her feet, she's got a beautiful point. So I think that she's a dancer when I look at that cover.
Yeah, no kidding. No, I think you're right. I think that my artist said she had to go out and get a bike for this one, but she still had the boots, which are really fantastic boots.
Yeah, she has some great clothes.
Yeah. I thought of another story while you were saying all this, because you were saying as an illustrator, that it's your job to first get someone to pick up the book, not to exactly do a scene in it. So I remember, so this cover is one that was finished. This is Copperhead, which is the second in my Iron Skin series. They are Gothic series. They're dark fantasy. They're adult YA crossover. The first one is sort of a Gothic Jane Eyre retelling with magic. And this one is actually based on a different Bronte book. But at any rate, they were working on the cover while I was still working on the book. So I got to see this cover and see my protagonist, who is Helen in this one, before I had turned in my manuscript. And I'd given them a sort of general idea about what's on it. Helen is a socialite. She's, she's endangered. It follows very much the beautiful cover that he had done for my first book. And of course, I've just forgotten his name, and I bet I could find out in a second. It follows on the beautiful cover that he did for Iron Skin of Jane. And this is Jane's sister, Helen. But anyway, I took that and I said, I'm going to describe that exact outfit she's wearing in one of these scenes because I still have time to do that. And so I put that exact outfit then into one of the scenes I was working on. And I thought I was really excited I got to do that. And that's Larry Restant, who's really great. And I appreciate the 3 covers he did for me for that series.
A lot of my stories are actually inspired by pictures I saw someplace, or at least the seeds of those stories are. So, you know, a picture tells stories. A story creates mental pictures. They are both doing a little bit of the other, I think. So it must be interesting to see a cover for a book you're still working on. I wonder if it changes your own sort of scent of parts of the story. I mean, besides describing an outfit.
Yes. So in fact, I'll say that this is number 2 in Seriously Wicked again. They were really ahead of schedule for this one. So they said, you know, what do you think it should be on the cover? And I had just started writing the book and I was like, I think pretty sure there's a bike in it. Yeah, there's going to be some bikes in it. And so they came back with this cover. And so meanwhile, I was totally stuck on the book. And I was making false starts and I was getting nowhere. So I had just basically thrown out everything I had when I got this email in my inbox. It was like, here's your cover. Isn't it great? And I'm like, yeah, it's really great. I love it. I have no book. So at that point, I decided I was going to go back to my hometown, Lawrence, Kansas, for a little while in the summer, a few weeks with the children. And I would give the children to the grandparents. And I would go up to KU, where Kish teaches, whom you guys had recently, actually. She was running a little writing retreat. So I was like, I will get this book written there. But and I did, actually. I spent 10 days there, and I wrote 4,000 words every single day, which I've never done before nor since. And I came out with a 0th draft, which means like a really, really crummy draft, but I had one. It all hung together, and there was a story. And then I could revise that story when it was due in 1 month. So, yeah, that was the fastest I've ever written a book, and I'm actually very, very fond of this particular book. But, yeah, so when I went to Kansas, all I had was, well, it's got to have a bike in it. And I told them Seriously Shifted because it had stuff about shapeshifters, so it's still going to have shifters and bikes. Here we go.
You shift bikes too. So
you do shift bikes too. It was a good pun, yeah.
So you play a game with your kids when you're walking to school. I would like you to talk about this game that you play with your kids.
Yeah. So it can be hard to get my kids motivated to go out the door to school back when we all did things like going out the door to school. So,
which we will again someday.
Yes, we will. Knock on wood. So one of the things I started doing was I was like, maybe I could, come here out the door. I'll start telling you a story about a dragon. And I don't know if I'm naturally an oral storyteller because I don't always write in order. I often write really out of order, and that makes it hard to just sit down and tell a story and have it come out. But luckily, my kids were not really interested in having me just tell a story and have it come out. They wanted to help tell all the stories. So so it turned out to actually be really fun. We just sort of got to where we would, really all do sort of joint storytelling together as we walked. And it's a sort of thing, it was easier when it was just me and one of them at a time, but then once they all ended up in the same grade school, then it was me and 2 of them at a time, and they both have very different ideas about what makes a good story. Since one of them comes from more of the Star Wars Minecraft end of things, and the other one is more into the My Little Pony end of things, you can imagine that sometimes these stories don't always mesh up. But so we started, in addition to telling stories, we just started inventing also little kind of story type games, for example. And it turned out to be a good way to move them up the hill to school.
So do you think that your kids' storytelling skills have improved with this game?
I do think so, honestly, just from like all the stuff we talk about, because I remember like telling my oldest, like, um, for example, explaining to him that the protagonist he was inventing, you know, a very powerful dragon, had to have some weaknesses. Your dragon cannot have all the powers and none of the weaknesses and always succeed in everything he tries. So, so I remember like discussing that with him and watching his opinions on what makes a good story slowly change as he got older. And so then we got to the point where he was saying, okay, and this dragon can do this power, but he's got this flaw. So, you know, I did see change happening, which was really fun to watch. I'm like,
Yes.
maybe I'm not, you know, who knows if my kids will ever know any math again, but they'll be able to tell a story.
And you know, in a minute, we're going to talk about why it's important that they can tell a story, even if they never do any math again. The second half of my question about this is, as their storytelling abilities have improved, or at least become more complex and thoughtful and sophisticated, do you see that as having any impact on the way they navigate life in general?
Gosh, I absolutely do. So it's like, I mean, the power of story, one of the things that I come back to, of course, is like the power of representation. So being able to see yourself in a story is a very powerful thing to say, you know, oh, the girl in that story was an astronaut. I could be an astronaut, is a very sort of, you know, obvious example of people seeing themselves in stories and realizing that they can do things, or they can be things, that they can be a certain way, that they don't have to be everything, only the things that they've learned so far at life or in their home life or whatever it is. And when I'm talking with, so that's just in like, that's the important thing that the author has to do when they're writing the story. They have to think hard about, I think you have to think hard about sort of, are you reinforcing bad tropes, bad, what is the word? But bad prejudices, bad stereotypes. Thank you. Am I reinforcing bad things?
My pleasure.
You did great. But am I reinforcing bad things, or am I being very conscious to think about what I am doing, and to try to make sure that the story I'm telling reflects the complexity of the world around me and the complexity of the way I want the world to be. So all those things I think about as an author, and all those things are things that I talk to the kids about as well when we're talking about storytelling. So, you know, because a 9-year-old boy who's inventing a world full of dragons might just invariably go, you know, okay, he's got 5 dragon friends and they're all boys too. And so then I say, okay, well, let's actually make sure we make this a gender balanced story. And let's talk about what pronouns these dragons actually have, because maybe, you know, this one's a girl, maybe this one uses they, them pronouns. You know, let's back it up a minute and not just make it a story that's populated by 100% boys, which is a totally natural thing to think. If you're a 9-year-old boy and your friends are boys, of course you're like, and I have a story full of dragon boys. So it's just like on a very basic level, I'm like, okay, let's think about what kind of story we want to tell and think about how we want to tell it.
Right. Because everything you just said points to the fact that storytelling isn't just about entertainment. Storytelling shapes life.
Yeah.
That's what you've just been saying. Storytelling matters because it shapes life.
Yeah.
And how we tell stories, or how well we tell stories, has an impact on how we end up actually doing our real lives.
Mm-hmm.
We started this whole summer series with a presentation called At the Heart of Everything Human is Story, where we talked about how important storytelling is in everybody's normal daily lives, literally from the minute they get up till the minute they go to sleep, from the day they were born till the day they die, how much storytelling they're actually doing. What a huge impact all that storytelling has on shaping who their own identity and their lives.
Mm-hmm.
And what a huge impact good storytelling or bad storytelling can have on how well things go for ourselves and others as communities and as individuals. And I really wanted you to talk about that game, because it's another instance of the way that you are practicing storytelling as an art with your kids as you're walking someplace, and literally helping them to improve their ability to write the story of their lives, not just in a book, for somebody to read for fun, but to write the story of their lives as they're living the lives they're writing now and into the future. That's a big deal. And they are very lucky to have a mom who can just sort of get them working on those skills. You know, that's a pretty amazing thing. So have your kids, as they were helping you make up stories, have your kids ever given you an idea that was so useful you ended up using it in a book?
Oh, yes. Well, honestly, I mean, yeah. So sometimes I'm like, ooh, that is so good. I feel kind of guilty about using it, but it's so good. I would say definitely they've given me lots of good ideas. And in fact, my son now is very invested in the idea that he can help me fix all the jokes in my books. So whenever I'm working on something, he says, "Mom, now you give me the manuscript, and I'll help make all the jokes better," which is
Great.
honestly pretty great help.
Is that the younger son or the older son who does?
Well, my 9-year-old is a boy, my 6-year-old is a girl.
Oh.
So the 9-year-old is he's very into the idea he's gonna help me fix all my humor, but he's pretty funny. So usually it means add more bananas, which makes sense.
Add more bananas and a bit more cowbell, right?